that's a great tie-in, because one of the chapters in the book is entirely devoted to the book of Job. And I can't think of a more important passage than where we are right now, which is coming to finally, after we have waited and Job has waited, and even his friends to some degree have waited, that God is finally going to have his chance to speak. And when he speaks, as you already know, he says things that are very unexpected. They take us out of our comfort zone. They took Job out of his comfort zone. And so as we come to this part of it, I think we're addressing one of three things that really send people into a tailspin in life. I brought these up earlier because psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you that three things that really disorient people in general, and I would say these wouldn't even be Christians as much as people who have some sense that there's a God in the world. Three things that can send anyone into a tailspin. When we suffer great losses, and especially if those losses are all coming within a very short time. This has a tendency to bring on depression, despair, disorientation. And if you've gone through an experience like that, you know that Job's experience was a disorientation. Secondly, when people disappoint us, friends, family, people that we thought we could count on, and now we're in the depths of the crisis, and we are now finding out that we can't count on them as much. I think every character in the story of Job is well-intentioned and had really best interests in mind. His wife, I think we have to give her a lot of grace. Job's wife has lost everything that Job has. Well, maybe not quite everything, but the equivalent of everything that Job has, because Job's wife has also lost Job. Her husband now, who has been an integral part of her life, has been taken out of the picture. And so I think we need to give her some grace and understanding in the way she reacts. The friends are well-intentioned. They have a theology that they really believe in, that this explains all of life. And as we discovered last week, their theology isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. There needs to be more room in their theology for the mysteries of life. And that's, if I had to pick out one area where Job's friends are inadequate, it's their zeal to prove a certain viewpoint, a certain theology, drives them to be very insensitive to Job and to no longer have the compassion that they once had for him. I think when they first came, they had a great deal of compassion. Our passage today is going to remind us, or is going to hopefully reverse something that Job was feeling as well. And that is, he was disillusioned with God. Why did this God with whom he has a relationship that he believed was very deep, why does God abandon him in situations like this? And even for folks who are not Christians, who are not believers in God in a deeper way, they often feel this when they go through the trials of life, that God has abandoned me. And this sense of abandonment by God, abandonment by other folks around us, is a primary reason that people slip into a sense of despair in life. Because I have no support system whatsoever. For us as Christians, it can be even more intense, because we know that God is there, and we know that God is real, and yet there are experiences that we go through, especially those of great losses, where we really do have that sense of abandonment from God. As many of you know, the Psalms, the lament Psalms, really express this, the sense of God having taken away everything, and he no longer cares. God, I'm hurting, my enemy is winning, and you don't seem to care, is a good way to think of a lament psalm. And that disillusionment with God is a very real thing, and it sometimes can lead to that stress and depression. I hope that what we see at the end of the book of Job reminds us of things that will reverse that in a sense and help us to go another way. Now, before we get into God's speech, what I've found about this passage, the more I've looked at it, when God finally does speak, is that there are a number of things that have been said already that are a part of the context, especially the context of the dialogue between Job and his friends. They're easy to miss because of the verbose nature of those chapters. There is so much material there. We read over it quickly at times and we lose sight of some things that have already been said. And I want to go back actually with a list of those things. And in fact, I'm going to put it on the screen and just ask for each of you to take one of these. I think we have about right here. If I could go right down the line here. Okay, Sean, if you'll take the chapter 7 passages. Mike, if you'll take both, do you have a Bible there? Yeah. Both of the chapter 10 passages. I'm going to skip it. Well, I'll just go right in line there. Frank, go ahead with chapter 13, 1 to 3, and Caitlin, if you'll take 13, 18 to 23. Debating here about which one of these to do. Yeah, let's go ahead with it. Ivan, go ahead with 23, 3 to 5. And Yuri, if you will take 30, 16 to 30. I'm sorry, 16 to 23. And I'm going to actually add. No, let's leave it like it is. Okay. We'll go. I'm going to jump in at 31, so I'll leave you two guys out over here for a moment. What I encourage you to do is, even though someone else is reading it, let's turn to the passages, and I'll make just a few comments as we go along. What I find helpful is, as we really look back closely at things that have been said in this discussion, God's speech makes a lot more sense. God is going to say some things that are deep, but the way that he presents his words in chapter 38 through 42 makes a lot more sense if we understand some things that have already been said. So Sean, get us started here with, first of all, chapters 7, 13, and 14.
If I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me by visions. 17 through 20.
Yeah, and then do 17 through 20 also.
What is man that you magnify him, and that you are concerned about him, that you examine him every morning and try him every moment? Will you never turn your gaze away from me, nor let me alone until I swallow my spittle? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself?
Okay, good. We see a number of things going on here in what I've thought of as a developing attitude that is Job. Now, notice the chapter here. We're in the very early part of the dialogue between Job and his friends. In some cases, Job responds to his friends, but in many cases, Job is praying to God. And here is one of those prayers that he is praying to God. He is scared, he says in verses 13 and 14. In fact, God is already, in his minds, is scaring him with dreams and with visions. I think it even makes more intense the vision that he's going to have of God at the end, the appearance of God in the storm that's going to come. So Job already in his early experiences is expressing this idea of a great fear of God, especially as he's going through this tragedy. The second part of the passage is the beginning, I think, a real beginning of this developing attitude by Job that God has abandoned him. And he doesn't have it as strongly here, but he is beginning to accuse God of not being fair. God, you simply haven't treated me fairly. And this is much like, the words I would say are much like a psalm of lament, where he is crying out, how long will you not look at me, or will you look away from me? How long will you leave me till I swallow my own spit, and so forth? If there's sin, point it out to me. So Job is becoming emboldened, I guess would be the word, to express himself more assertively to God here. At the same time, he's also scared to death to do that. Okay, Mike, if you'll read for us the passage out of, two passages out of 10.
I am disgusted with my life. I will express my complaint and speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not declare me guilty. Let me know why you prosecute me. Is it good for you to oppress, to reject the work of your hands, and favor the plans of the wicked? You produce new witnesses against me, and multiply your anger toward me. Hardships assault me, wave after wave. Why did you bring me out of the womb? I should have died and never been seen. I wish I had never existed, but had been carried from the womb to the grave. Are my days not few? Stop it. Leave me alone so that I can smile a little.
So, a man who, much like in chapter 3, wishes he were a non-entity. He wishes he had never, over in Mike read in verse 18. Why did you bring me out of the womb? In other words, why did you let me be born in the first place? Would that I had died before any eye had seen me. If I had to be born, Lord, I'd rather be a stillborn child. I'd rather be dead than facing any of this life. Here we really sense again some of this despair that a man is crying out. He is hurting so badly that he is crying out to God, wishing that he had never been born. But at the same time, we find him frustrated with God. Back to verses 1 to 3. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me. As we get into some of these passages, one of the points that is interesting about the wording, and again, we're reading the poetry written about the story. We can't guarantee that all of these words would have been Job's words by any means, but the poetry about it, about this dialogue, is heavily filled with legal terminology that would be used in a courtroom, where Job is calling God into court, and he is calling God to be a witness on his behalf. So the legal terminology that is later on going to appear in God's speech, very important part of God's speech, actually began back with Job's words, and even a little bit in the words of Elihu and others, where they are speaking of all of this almost like a courtroom situation. What Job needs now is a witness who will speak up on his behalf. He's being accused of sin, and the sin resulted in the catastrophes in his life. And so his language is going to get stronger, but he basically says, Lord, tell me the charges that you have against me. Why are these things happening to me? He also says in the second passage, just leave me alone. His feeling here is, I wish I were not even a person anymore. Just leave me alone, God. Don't bother me. That's, of course, verse 20. Cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer. So we find on the one hand a frustrated man, but on the other hand a man who is developing an anger toward God, that God isn't stepping in to answer the charges that are made. Okay, Franklin, if we could go then to the next passage, which is in chapter 13.
Yeah, could I just say something what you
Yes.
just said?
Sure.
It's just saying that Job actually has the same theology just like his friends. He also sings that God punishes sinners. The only
Yes, he
difference
does.
between them is just he doesn't sing. He has to sing. So they have the same idea there.
Yeah, this what we've commonly called retribution theology, that God rewards good with good, and that God rewards evil with chastisement. That would have been what Job held to as well. Here's the problem. He knows in his own life that he has not sinned to bring this on. And yet, in his theology, and I think this may be the part of the reason that you're asking, his theology would lead him to believe that something has brought this on. So what is present in a few of the passages of Job's speeches would be the sense that maybe there are some hidden things here that I don't understand. God, and this is part of his reason for calling on God to speak, is not only that God is going to answer his friends, but that God will answer some of his questions. God, why is this happening? And I think you're absolutely right. The assumption here is that he believes that something must have brought this on in his life. So Job himself is being re-educated in his own theology here because he knows in his human experience that he has not done something to bring on this sin. It's just not there. It's a contradiction for him. It's a complexity of why life has dealt him the hand that it's dealt him when he knows that that doesn't fit with his theology. It doesn't fit at all. Okay, would you take us then to chapter 13?
Yes, Job says, behold, my eye has seen all this, my ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I will speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God.
And then on over to 18.
Behold, I have prepared my case. I know that I shall be in the right. Who is there who will contend with me? For then I will be silent and die. Only grant me two things, that I will not hide myself from your face. Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not dread of you terrify me. Then call, and I will answer, or let me speak, and you reply to me. How many are my iniquities and my sins? Make me know my transgression and my sin.
Okay, the only thing I would say, Caitlin, is just with the tone that you read it, the last verses have questions. Yeah, they could be taken as an exclamation. How many are my iniquities and my sins? But how many are my iniquities and my sins? I mean, he really doesn't believe that there are any. And yet he knows that he's in a situation where this seems to be a result of his sins. Make me know my transgressions. All this is filled with heavy language of courtroom, calling on God now to speak up in a legal courtroom situation. It would have been a common motif, a common way of expressing oneself in argument, in dialogue here. But it's very powerful because God's later going to also speak with legal terminology. And as you look at the way that Job has expressed himself, this is all the way back in chapter 13, so this is very early in the dialogue. Job is setting up, even in his own words, he's setting up the way God is going to respond to him. Did you notice the words, verse 1? My eye has seen all of this, and my ear has heard and understood it. That's exactly the expression that Job is going to use later after he finally is beginning to understand what God is saying to him. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you, is what Job is going to say later. So the early discussion, and in this case as we move a little bit later, is very much using terminology that will be made much more meaningful later in the speech of God and in the response of Job. But in addition to that, what we see early on is a lot of the charges. As Caitlin just read her part in chapter 13, Job is more emboldened here than he was earlier. He is, probably because of the dialogue of his friends, he's becoming very frustrated. And so now he is going to speak up with words that are rather bold before God, even though he admits that he's scared of God. He says, verse 18, behold, I prepared my case, and I know that I shall be in the right. God, I'm going to prove my case to you, and I can guarantee you right now that I'm going to be in the right. But at the same time, he is fearful of God as well, which he should be. Okay, let's go on then. We were in chapter 13. Let's go on to chapter 23. Ivan, would you read those verses for us, 3 to 5?
Sure.
find him. If only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would find out what he would answer me and consider what he would say.
Again, just to emphasize here, Job's wishing to lay his case before God. He's showing great confidence. I would know what he would answer me, and I would understand what he would say to me. We're going to find out later that Job has no idea what God is saying to him. Well, he figures it out, but when God first answers, it's language that is so mysterious to him that initially he cannot figure this out. God is not going to answer in the way that Job expects here. But again, coming across with great confidence. And Yuri, if you would read then for us 30:16.
Now my soul is poured out within me, days of affliction have seized me. At night it pierces my bones within me, and my gnawing pains take no rest. By a great force my garment is distorted, it binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you for help, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you turn your attention against me. You have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride, and you dissolve me in a storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house of meeting for all living.
You can really see here, much like a lament psalm, a man crying out in deep despair. Remember, this would be Job's prayer to God just prior to Elihu speaking in chapter 32. And he is expressing here just a real sense of hopelessness. God, you've been cruel to me. Verse 21. With the might of your hand you have persecuted me. So he really feels by this point that it is God who has turned on him, and a real sense again of despair in the midst of all of that, but also his frustration that God is not saying anything. Why, God, why aren't you speaking up? Again, the powerful language that we'll hear will appear a little bit later. Okay, I just want to point out in the passages here, as I think I already have, a lot of legal terminology. Job's demand throughout several of these passages that he could argue his case, that he could go to court with God, that God would become his witness, and God would speak on his behalf because Job has been falsely charged by his friends. There's a portion of Elihu's speech that I think is really significant. We're not going to read all of it, but in Elihu's speech, a lot of people say that Elihu really doesn't say anything. And in some ways, I think you could address that. I talked about this a bit last week. Elihu doesn't bring anything really new to the table in terms of what he has said. What Elihu says, the friends, that is the other older men, have already said, and Elihu is just reaffirming some of the retribution theology that they have said. He does add a new element, but Eliphaz early in the discussion had already said this, and that is Elihu views the trials of life as a way that God cleanses us, helps us to move away from our sins, and also brings us to greater maturity. And so Elihu says some things that seem to be new, but if we look back closely at the speeches of the other older men, we discover that they've already said this. But I find this part of the story fascinating, not relating backward, but relating forward. In Elihu's speech in chapter 36 on into chapter 37, he has a tremendous statement about the physical creation, about the evidence of God's greatness found in the created world. And in this discussion, he says we cannot understand God's creation. That even though it speaks of a God who is great and majestic and all that he is, we really cannot fully understand it. He would not have known at the time that he is speaking, but this is going to become a key to understanding God's speech later on. God is going to use the physical created world as his illustration. And there is going to be so much mystery wrapped up in that created world that it's almost impossible for Job, well, it is impossible for Job to really answer any of God's questions. So Elihu's speech leading up to God's speech is, some teachers have said that this provides a great pause, almost in the sense of drama. As we're waiting on God to speak, there's still one more delay here, and Elihu's talk to the three men plus Job is going to delay God's speech almost in a very dramatic way as we're waiting on God to speak. But I think it's more than that. I think some of the things that Elihu says actually are terminology that are picked up in God's speech, and God later on is going to say some of the same things. So Elihu really does make a contribution. I think it's not necessarily a lot of things new, but the terminology is very much helping us as we get into the speech of God. Yes, Ivan.
Yeah. Let's get back to the courtroom idea. Do you think the court setting implies also the present judgment?
The idea of judgment.
Present judgment? Present judgment?
Present judgment.
I mean, there's no God will judge in the present time instead of the end of the time.
I don't think it is the idea as much of judgment. Do you mean in the way that Job's friends would see his life, that somehow God is judging him for the things that he might have done?
The idea of retribution is like suffering, so God will judge at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the implication idea about the people crying help, and then
Right. Right.
implication to others.
You know, in this case, I think, that theme is more coming out of retribution theology, that God will bring judgment to those who are disobedient to him. So it very much is in the story of Job and in the dialogue between his friends. When we get specifically to the legal terminology, I've put it in these terms. It's Job who wants to take God to court. And the reason he wants to take God to court is that he desperately needs a witness to prove that he is right. And so what I think, rather than thinking of that as a part of the retribution theology, rather the legal terminology is Job's way of defending himself more than anything else. He believes that God should speak on his behalf, and in order to answer the charges of his friends. And so it would fit more into the category of Job's defense than it would the area of retribution theology, I think. This is how Job believes that he can be vindicated to show that what he is saying is right. And remember, by this time, the rhetoric has intensified as we move through the 3 rounds. So everybody's mad at everybody. Job is mad at his friends because they will not give up on their charges against him. His friends are angry at Job because he is unwilling to admit what they believe is the inevitable, that Job has sinned. So there's a lot of intensity that is going on here. And I think that even adds to Job's charges. Now, we'll talk about it in a moment, but the question is, has Job now crossed over the line to sin against God in his charges? God, you owe it to me to come to the courtroom and to testify on my behalf. That's an important question as we later on look at Job's responses. Has he sinned? Has Job sinned here in what he is calling on God to do? Zach?
Just a thought, and kind of just piecing together some of the different perspectives, and just throw this out there, and it's not something I've read, but it seems like the common factor with like Job and his friends, the 3 friends, is that they both seem to assume that what happens to a person in his life, i.e. Job, is in some way contingent on that person.
Mhm.
And what certainly Yahweh brings into the scene, and then I wonder if Elihu does this too, is the perspective of it's not dependent on a person's life, but rather on God's sovereign will. So
Mhm.
it kind of removes
Mhm.
the consequences of a person's life from
Mhm.
being contingent on that person's behavior one way or the other. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think does Elihu sort of
I
introduce
think
that?
I think he does. When you read many people's comments about Elihu or Elihu, they see him as not really contributing anything. I think he does, in the sense that you're pointing out. He has more of an emphasis on the sovereignty of God in all of this, and that God may take actions that we will not fully understand, and that's why he appeals to the physical creation. There are things about that we don't understand. I would agree with you. I think that Elihu, more than the others, moves that direction. But he doesn't make large arguments that are really something new compared to the friends. He still believes in retribution theology. He just believes that we can't understand all of it. He does not necessarily in any way show that he thinks that Job is innocent. I think he would agree that he talks about the cleansing aspects of suffering, or the way God might use suffering. That would make the assumption he believes that Job has sinned in some way. But he is frustrated with the friends because they haven't been able to prove that. In all of this dialogue, they have not been able to prove. So there are things about Elihu's speech that really make a contribution here, though he isn't, in the final analysis, he isn't right about everything. I think that's where it comes down. Franklin.
I'm just thinking, if Elihu says something right, which God is going to say to Job, I'm just interested by thinking, so suppose Elihu is right, which he is right, so why can't his message convince Job? Because he is not God.
Do you mean Elihu's message?
Yeah, his message about God's sovereignty, even though it's totally right, which God is going to use the same message to convince Job.
Yeah.
But because Elihu is not God.
Yeah.
So even though he says the right thing, it
Yeah.
doesn't really change. But my point, I guess it is, sometimes it really requires God himself to speak the same words so
Yeah.
that it carry the sovereignty, I guess.
No. Well, there's no question God's speech is going to be a necessary exclamation point on all of this. My answer to your point would be, I don't think by the time that Elihu speaks that Job is in any state of mind to listen to anybody. And that was partly why I wanted to read some of Job's words as we get close to Elihu's speech, because by that time Job is really adamant that God owes this to him and that God's speaking is the only way. And even though Elihu says some good things, I don't think that Job is really tuning in on that. They're more for our sake. Elihu's words are for our sake. And I think though, he says some things that are very helpful to understand the rest of it. Now, I had asked you to do and handed back the papers today. Zach, here are your assignments. But I'd ask you to do a little thinking on this. You've done some reading, and you know that when God finally speaks, it's a surprise to everybody. Job and his friends have been answering philosophical, theological questions, and they want answers for those. So what is God doing here? What is this all about, where God asks him a bunch of science questions? Some writers have called this a science exam that Job flunks terribly because he can't answer any questions. If you've been discouraged on some of your exams, you've never had one like this where your mouth is shut and you simply can't answer anything on this one. As we get into these chapters, I want to look at a few of the details, but what is God's answer here? I know this is a big question, but I did ask you to do some thinking about it. what is God's answer, and how is it connected with this series of questions that he asks? Zach?
You know, I actually probably would rather answer it. I think it's Estes that, you know, there's a quote that just stuck in my mind that, you know, Job starts to see much of the universe is beyond his understanding, and his situation fits into that category. So, you know, it's kind of like, you know, God confronts Job with this overwhelming, perplexing universe, physical universe, and so, you know, kind of by implication, your situation is you know, thereby a part of that
Good.
that world that you can't
Good.
understand.
Good. And you've actually touched on, I think, the connection. It's interesting that God's approach here, as we look at it, is to, some have suggested, God changes the subject. He goes to what seems to be at the moment an entirely different subject, what we would call science, and to look at the physical world. But Zach, elaborate a little bit more. What part of that story then relates to Job? Because Job's are really philosophical, theological questions more than anything else. What is he teaching him from the science lesson?
Well, you know, again, just kind of the way that his, you know, Job's personal universe sort of fits into the general physical universe, and, you know, and how, you know, neither one are within his realm of understanding, you know.
Okay, good.
So,
Good. The last thing you said is really important.
yeah.
There are many things, in fact, most things about the way the physical creation works that, Job, you have no idea how to explain them. You have no understanding whatsoever. Some of us, I think, in here have perhaps in earlier years studied in the sciences. And we know that we live in an era where a lot of advancement has come in the study of the physical world. Biology, botany, zoology, all of these fields are reflected in God's speech. But any of us who are honest would be the first to say, even after PhD studies in many of these fields, we only barely scratch the surface of what there is to really know about what the why, the questions of why, or how or why. Now, what I don't like about scientific study is those teachers who are godless, who don't believe in a creator. It's not that I don't like the teachers, because I had a lot of them, but who are so arrogant to think that we really do know the answers to these questions, at least in the way that they present it. They might say, well, there are a lot of things that we don't know, but anyone who really studies the sciences and who is honest about it realizes that there's so many unanswered questions. And some of them we can get into as we look at the details of this. So the point of the speech in relation to the scientific world or the physical world is not as much the answers to those questions. It's the fact that Job doesn't know the answers to those questions. And that's what you're saying, Zach, that there are many things that Job doesn't understand. So Job, translate that now into your world. You don't understand why you are going through what you're going through. I think the parallel is being made there. God understands a lot more than you are. You are not God. And let me go to the punchline. Can you trust me? Can you trust me? Remember the first day of class? I'll go back to that slide a little bit later. I said, this is a book where the tempting focus that we want to give is to say, Job is a book about suffering. And I would agree, there's a lot about suffering in this book. It informs us some of the purposes, especially chapters 1 and 2, where we're allowed behind the scenes in heaven. But a better way to describe Job is a book about faith. This is a book about faith. Can I trust God when I'm experiencing things I don't understand? Experiencing things I cannot explain. So good comment. We've elaborated a little bit. What are some other things that you might have written down in that discussion question you've seen, Joe? Caitlin?
I thought it was interesting because I wrote part of my paper on this section, and some of the commentators that I wrote made it seem like God was almost like really strongly rebuking Job and like putting him in his place, and had this like judgment connotation to it almost.
Okay.
And so I thought it was interesting when I was reading Estes that he made the comment that it's for education and not judgment. And so like definitely firm in the way that God responds to Job, but for Job's own good. So there was something about the idea like how he responded to Job, and his questions and the way that Job was hurting, confused, and suffering. That yes, it broadened like Job's perspective, but like out of love, like there was something about like something about like this assignment like showed kind of God's heart or like motive in the way that he responded to Job, as opposed to like shut up, you don't know me kind of thing.
Right,
which is
an angry God
yeah.
who Job should fear versus a nurturing God who is being firm with Job, but is and very honest with Job, but he is still doing it with a spirit of gentleness. What did you think, Caitlin, or anyone? I'll open this up to anyone also. I don't know about you, but I would not have wanted to be Job standing there when God finally speaks. There was a pretty sobering experience there in the storm when God speaks out of the storm. But did you think God was gentle with Job? That's a question that sometimes is debated here. Is God being mean? Is God mean-spirited in the way that he approaches Job? And of course the assumption is maybe Job deserved that. So maybe Job deserved an element of judgment here from God. Or is God actually, in the way that he goes about it, is he being gentle with him? Any sense in that? Any conclusions that you reached? We know that by character, God is not going to be doing anything that is not good for Job. But is he being angry? Is he responding in anger, or is he responding with gentleness?
I think he's responding with truth. And someone said, like I heard someone say a couple weeks ago, that if Jesus loved the way that we love, he would have lived to a ripe old age. In the sense of like, so often we don't speak the truth, or we don't say the hard thing, or the firm thing, or the humbling thing for someone else.
Okay, good.
And so, yeah, I think that, based on your view of God, you could think it's mean, but if you believe that God's really good, then like sense like the come from, like, or like the heart behind it. So for me, like I think it's like gentle or whatever, but I can see other people think God's just being mean.
I agree with you. I think God speaks truth here, and it at times is going to seem as though some have said even unkind to Job, but in the long-range picture, it is exactly what Job needs. You use an important word here. If the purpose is to humble Job, which I think it is, then a firmness and a clear statement of truth were necessary by God. Not in a mean-spirited way, but in a very clearly stated way. Zach?
I totally agree, and I was just thinking, this is a little bit off, but every night I read my 8-year-old son out of the Action Bible that he has. It's got pictures, and interestingly enough, last night we read the story of Job, and I was really impressed that this picture Action Bible, actually took on Job. And what I thought was really powerful was at the end of the book where God confronts Job, and of course this is an author's or an illustrator's depiction, but it's just an overwhelming brilliance that kind of overshadows little tiny, Job figure, but it's a very bright, illuminating light. And so I think, like Caitlin was saying, I think it was overwhelming, but it was truth. There was a light, if you will, in a literal and a philosophical sense. It was truth and not, not a it was a tempest, but not, darkness and, deception. So, yeah.
Frank?
It's hard to answer a question because gentleness or meanness is very subjective item. We should judge, could God come and say, hey Job, let's have some quiet time, I know you're suffering, say something, comfortable before he go to the harsh things. Of course, you might think of a few other ways to do that. And you might find that the other way to present this truth in a more coded way or more still clear, but maybe more gentle way. He refused to answer Job.
Yeah, I think the delay in God speaking is exactly that. Because it's Job who is demanding of God.
Yeah.
There's an attitude developing here that I want to point out as we get to Job's responses to God's speech that does involve sin and presumptuousness on his part. If we could even use the word an arrogance there, but we need to be careful because Job is a man who is deeply hurting. But yes, I think the need for God to be firm here was because of this developing attitude in Job. And also I think an attitude even in his friends. Remember, by the time we get to the end of the dialogue of Job and his friends, there's a lot more heat being generated than light. There's very little light being shed on anything because they're all angry at one another. And they're arguing theology, they're arguing philosophy, and what God really wants to get to is something much more important than that, and that is who he is, and an understanding of who he is. Let's talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts, and I think out of this come some examples of what God was trying to do. Before we look at the things that God says, notice the introduction to God's speech, chapter 38, verse 1. By the way, this is the first use, I think it's the very first, if it isn't the first, it is certainly sparing in the earlier parts, of the word Yahweh. Earlier there have been other names of God that were used that were definitely more majestic. Some have suggested because Job is probably not an Israelite, he is not part of the people of Israel, perhaps coming out of one of the neighboring nations around Israel, that using the name of Yahweh in all of their discussion would not have been normal anyway. But when we get to this part, I think it's really significant that the writer is using God's name Yahweh, the covenant name of God, the more personal name of God, to refer to him in chapter 38, verse 1. Yahweh answers Job out of the whirlwind. Never forget, the most catastrophic loss of Job was because of a whirlwind. His children had all died as a result of a wind knocking down a house. And now, of all things to choose, God is going to speak out of a storm, out of a whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me. I will question you and make it known to you. Again, this is the part that I don't know. I would not have wanted the Job standing there. But if you look back at the words that we looked at earlier, Job deserves this. Job has pretty much called God on the carpet and said, God, you owe it to me to come and step into my place. And now God is saying, no, Job, like the storm around you, you're darkening the discussion, you're darkening the counsel. Words without knowledge. In other words, a lot of words being thrown out with very little knowledge. And then, of course, we launch into this series of 70 questions about the creation, about the sustaining of the creation, about the inception of the creation. What a beautiful piece of poetry. That no matter what you get out of this, you have to stand back and just admire the poetry that is here. It is so beautiful. So many poetic ways of talking about it adds so much to Genesis 1 and 2. Most of you, almost all of you, I think, wrote a little bit. Some of you wrote quite a bit on this passage when you wrote your paper on creation, and you should have. I hopefully gave you a clue that this is an important passage, and it really is one of the most beautiful expressions of God's creative actions. Of course, he begins the origin of the whole thing. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. Down a little bit later, God is going to repeat expressions like this. Job, go ahead and interrupt if you understand what I'm talking about here. I think God is sarcastic at some points. I think we'd have to admit here that God is really putting Job in his place. And it's the truth that is going to put Job in his place. Job, I'm going to ask you some questions. Go ahead, interrupt me anytime you know the answer to the question. But God's not going to stop asking the question. He's just going to go on one after the other. And at no point does Job have an answer for any of these questions. Creation of the world. Sarcasm, verse 5. Who determined the measurements? Well, surely you must know, Job. There's a bit of sarcasm there. Or who stretched the line upon it? Picturing here an architect who is building his creation. The ocean, very interesting motif here in verses 8 through 11. Who shut the sea with doors when it burst out of the womb? We have metaphors here going all over the place. One is that of childbirth. God's picturing the inception of the world like a baby being born, bursting forth from the womb. But he also has architectural and building terminology here. Who shut the door? Who shut the sea in with doors? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling hand. When I prescribed limits for it and set bars and doors. So he's picturing here the ocean or the sea that has boundaries to it. You know, I love this one, verse 11. And I said, thus far shall you come, and no further. Here shall your proud ways be stayed. We live right by the ocean. We live about a quarter of a mile from the ocean. And my wife and I love going down there. And many of you probably do too, just walking along the ocean. I've not been a devoted body surfer or surfer, but I have done a little bit of it. And I do know this. I have a lot of respect for the power of the ocean. When you get in there, especially on some of ours is a west-facing beach, when you get waves coming from the west, you have to be really careful on the ones that you tackle. And some of you are probably better surfers than I am, especially body surfing. I remember when I first met my wife, I'm not from Southern California, so I did not grow up here on the beaches, and first met my wife, and in those days I was doing just boogie boarding with a board, not even surfing, but boogie boarding. And I remember tackling some of those waves, and one day, I should have never been out there, but there were these huge waves. I'm talking about like 8 and 10 feet that were breaking. And so I get out there with my little boogie board, and a wave broke right in the middle of my back. Even with the board under me, it bent my back so far the wrong direction that I literally went for a year with a back injury as a result of all of that. I think you know what I'm talking about. Anybody who is in the ocean knows the amazing power of the ocean. This was a motif that was very important in ancient literature also. The ocean, or the waters of the ocean, were treated as mysterious by them and under the control of certain gods that they simply did not know. Later on, there's going to be a mysterious character called the Leviathan, which is like a dragon, an ocean dragon, and lived in the ocean. And those kinds of pictures are found all over in ancient literature outside of Israel's literature. So any time we run into the theme of the ocean, you can be sure that the people reading it, and in this case God speaking it, was to talk about the awesome power and the unpredictability of this mysterious part of their world. The ocean had a lot of mystery to it. What I see in this passage is that God has, from the very beginning, drawn lines. And he drew the line and said, okay, waves, you come this far and you're not going to go any further. It's picturing a God who is fully in charge of one of the most powerful and mysterious parts of our world, and that is the waters of the ocean. He's in charge of the sunrise and the sunset, 12 through 14. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? And have you caused, he's asking these questions of Job, have you caused the dawn to know its place? We're very fortunate to have a home on a hill that looks toward the east. Beautiful sunrise whenever it's clear, and in California it's clear most of the time. And I get up early, sometimes even before sunrise, but that sun, you can watch the predictability of it. Not only the time that it comes up, but as it moves across the sky in the winter and the summer, you can watch everything. And how amazing it is, and some of us who have studied the sciences know that much of this has been charted and calculated, and yet when God created all this, he built all of this into the physical creation. He was in charge of all of that. And as I'm sitting there studying early in the morning and watching the sun come up, I'm thinking, this is something that I never think about. I don't sit there worrying whether the sun's going to come up the next morning. It's a given, isn't it? It's automatic from our point of view. It's something that we simply take for granted. And yet every part of our universe functions in a way that is so beautifully built there by God. We call them laws of nature. In the animal world, which we get to in a moment, we call it instinct. Well, what are laws of nature and instinct? They are things that God has built into his physical creation. He's fully in charge. And as we go through each one of these illustrations, Job has no idea. He has no idea how God did this and how God has created all of this. He doesn't command the mornings and cause the dawn to know its place. It's someone greater than he who has done all of this. References here to the springs in the ocean, dimensions of the earth. I just love some of these expressions. Where is the way to the dwelling of light into the place of darkness? I mean, who defines light and darkness? Okay, you could go into a science class and you could talk about all the physical things that are happening here, but who put all those in place? Who was it that created all of these things? The snow and the hail, light and darkness, snow and hail, all the forces of nature here are pictured as coming from somewhere. They're stored somewhere. And then at the appropriate time, God brings them from their places. Now, we would have a scientific explanation for it, but this is poetic language helping us to appreciate God. The lightning, the storms, the thunder, the water and the ice. Rather surprising in here to find a reference, evidently an acceptance of the constellations of the stars. At this time, he refers here to some names that were probably understood to be gatherings of certain stars in the heavens. Do you know, verse 33, the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish the rule of the earth? Then he moves to his own body and physical description of the body. Verse 36, who has put wisdom in the inward parts? Actually, he's still talking here, I'm sorry, about the universe. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts? That's a great question. Who put instincts in animals? Who put physical forces into the universe that cause such predictable laws of nature that we can actually study for centuries laws of nature and never fully explain how things happen? Who put those things there? Are the questions that he's asking of Job. I remember as a little kid, and maybe you've had this experience, I grew up where you can actually see stars. In LA, it's so disappointing with the city lights. You gotta get out of town, right? Some of you have been a lot of places where you can see stars. I love going to mountainous areas, even in our local mountains here, but Colorado. Remember stopping when we were skiing up in Colorado. Literally just, you probably have done this, but if you haven't, you need to being up in mountainous areas where all the pollution in the air is gone. And you can see these stars and it's like they're just jumping out of the sky at you. I remember a number of times my wife and I just pulling off to the side of the road, just sitting there and looking. It is so overwhelming to see the heavens, the beauty in the heavens, which of course are talked about in the scripture. I remember as a little kid growing up in the Northwest, I used to camp out in our backyard. We had a farm, and so there was a lot of them doing that. And laying there for hours thinking, okay, I can see those stars there. Now I wonder what's beyond those stars. And I can remember as a little kid some of my early thoughts about, maybe this is what attracted me later to sciences, but about the universe and the questions that are raised by it. Okay, if there's something beyond that, then what's beyond that? And literally looking at the stars caused me to consider infinity. What is endless space? What is infinity? All those questions that come about considering things in the physical universe. We usually do this in the macro universe. We don't often do this in the micro universe, and that's what, in part, God is doing both in this discussion. He's looking at the macro, but he also is going to go to some very finely tuned things. And that's what the whole next section, as you know, is about quite a number of animals and birds. 39, 1-4. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? And do you know the time when they give birth? Talking about the gestation period of animals. I remember when we got our first puppy after we were married. My wife was totally against this, but I talked her into, okay, we want to get this dog spayed. It was a female, but let's have a litter of puppies. I was totally for this because I grew up on a farm, and I found it fascinating to watch animals being born. My wife was totally against it because she knew that this is going to be complicated. So I was a pastor, and we had our dog bred. We went through the process of having our dog bred professionally and so forth. And I'm in an important meeting at our church, and my secretary breaks into the meeting and says, "It's your wife on the phone," and she says, "You better answer right now." So I went out. Our dog was having puppies, and she was the only one left there at home. She said, "I can't handle this. Make an excuse, get out of the meeting, but I need you home here right now." So since it was my fault that the dog was having puppies, we didn't agree on that. I headed on home, about a 20-minute drive. I got there, puppies were all born. Mother's fine, puppies are fine. It was just the reality that, how did that mother dog know how to do that? She had never had puppies before. She didn't need my help. She didn't need my wife's help. And I think you're aware that almost all the illustrations of the animals here are wild animals. They're not animals that are domesticated. They have no help from human beings, and yet they know what to do. The flight of the birds, the gestation period of animals, what do we call it? Instinct? So where does that come from? And this all becomes the 70 questions. Becomes a powerful point to Job. Some of you have already made it earlier, but let me put it in a little different words. Job, you wake up every day of your life and you enjoy and experience my physical universe. Except if you get into the details, you have no idea how and why all this happens. You have no idea how it got here in the first place. You have no idea how it works. And yet, Job, you trust me, don't you? You trust me to run the physical universe. You don't lay awake at night worrying whether you're going to be able to handle it or run it. You trust me to run it. As Zach was taking us earlier. Let's translate that, Job, into your moral spiritual life. Can you trust me with your life? Can you trust me to manage the details of your life? You see, that's the question here, isn't it? The science lesson, the science exam that Job flunks because he can't answer any questions is the whole point. That Job, you don't understand everything. There are many things in this world that are mystery, and yet you've learned to trust me in them. You've learned to enjoy them and trust me. Let me use my own pitiful little experience here, but I'm by training an electrical engineer. And what I did just then is something that you do every day. Now, I could probably write a little paper on what happened just then, in all the details of the electricity that that switch was releasing to move through the wires, the way that electricity works can be explained, but even electrical engineers, even those who study it all of their lives, will tell you there are certain mysteries about electricity. And yet, daily, we all use it, don't we? We walk in a room, we turn on a switch, we don't even think about how that works. We simply trust that it is going to work. That's what God is doing with Job on a macro scale as he looks at the universe. He's saying, Job, you've learned to trust me in so many areas. Can you trust me now when mysteries and questions come up about your life that you don't fully understand? And that's why I like thinking of this Job, I like thinking of the book of Job as a book about faith more than a book about suffering. It's a book that teaches us something about faith through the context of a man's suffering. I think that's a good way to view what is going on in the great science lesson.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.